Alright, so this video is going to cover HCI methods. Not intended to be exhaustive, there's always new stuff popping out, new variations, but this will give you kind of the baseline and the right vocabulary to go with it. Alright, so this is one thing I wanted to call attention to because sometimes you will hear this. I know in HCI or in user experience, a lot of times we're kind of brought in late in the process, or our contributions aren't quite as heralded as our developer counterparts. And sometimes what you'll hear is people will throw this Henry Ford quote at you, which I'm actually not even sure if he really said or not. But the premise is, when asked about asking people if they wanted cars, they would have said they wanted faster horses. And what this is can sometimes be used as is a cudgel against user research. Like, well, we don't need to ask them because they don't actually know, or especially in the tech space nowadays, a situation of like, oh no, what we're building is so unique, it's like the car. Which may be, okay, but that doesn't mean user research isn't valuable. So what I would have said, let's say Henry Ford comes in and says this in a meeting, I would have said, okay, well, first off, a car is kind of a faster horse. So he did actually give them what they wanted. Second, that if that's all you ask and then you walk away, you're not actually doing user research right at all. It would have been, oh, you want a faster horse? Why do you want a faster horse? What are some of the, like, what are the pain points that your current horse does not solve? And that's really what we get at in user research and in a lot of these methods, is there's a depth to what people need and want, and they will lead you there accurately 100% of the time. You just have to actually, give them that time. And I would say, a lot of folks in engineering will use this quote, and I'll say, well, that's how we got instances like the Pinto, which I saw a quote once that was, the Pinto was much more successful than like the Chevy Vega if you just take out the whole spontaneous combustion aspect, which seems to be a caveat that kind of disproves the argument, I would think. Or even in more recent terms, the Ford Flex. I apologize if any of you have a Flex and love it. That's peculiar, because this is no good, this whole thing. And maybe some user research would have either captured that this is not what people wanted, or that it's what some people wanted and those people should not be listened to. But either way, just keep in mind, if you get thrown this quote, it's not, first of all, it might be apocryphal. Secondly, you're not really talking about what we're talking about. So another thing I wanted to cover is the necessity of methods. So some folks, especially in again, the kind of move fast, break things philosophy of the tech world, is they look at it as methods aren't super valuable, or we don't have to stick to them. And maybe in some cases. But what they give you is replicability. So you can, if you have a fixed method with a process, you can do that continuously with your users and get consistent feedback that's all the same. Makes coding that feedback way easier. We also need methods in order to really achieve improvement. We need to have some way of measuring the improvement. We need it for rigor, to make sure we're doing a thorough job of what we're being asked to do. This is also where you'll see quantitative versus qualitative breakdowns. There's different perspectives on that, but in general, I always come back to this XKCD comic about, who prefers qualitative over quantitative. and then the person has to use numbers in their response. And I think that gets at the point of everything's qualitative at the end of the day. At the end of all of your methods, those numbers you collected still have to be qualitatively explained. Then a question about formal methods. So this, especially if you're coming from a more strictly psychological background or something, you might think about that. You know, we have to be hyper particular, especially in the psychological space, for like inter-rater reliability and some of those validity things. You do want to keep an eye on those, especially if you're working in like a safety critical domain or something where your thoughts might get generalized. But I would say HCI doesn't have as much formalism, largely because computers are developing still at a pace that kind of makes formalism challenging. And then looking at user requirements and evaluation. You actually can't really collect good user requirements and then evaluate against those requirements without some type of methods. So, and methods are also in HCI and user experience how we answer specific questions. So like UI versus UX and the value there, or if our user is just not doing it right. And that's the going back to the absence of formality. There are some hyper formal aspects of HCI if you really want to use them. Cog tool or Cogulator are applications that do some of this, but you can use the keystroke level model or GOMS, the goal operator methods and systems, I think. I could be wrong. I can never remember the GOMS acronym in its entirety. I always miss one of them. Or cognitive task analysis type things. These are hyper robust, but also very rigorous. And I'll say you probably don't need to get down to the detail of a keystroke level model for a website for an insurance agent or an app that tries to predict your ice cream flavor. I mean, what you have to match your level of formality and rigor with the task at hand. And I mentioned, HCI shifting too quickly. The methods we used before the introduction of the iPhone, for example, are significantly different than the ones we use after the introduction of the iPhone. So, there's a temporal aspect to this that makes it difficult. Breadth of experiences is also way too great since computers are in everything. We can't formally do a task analysis for every type of interaction. There's just too many tasks, I'll say. But it doesn't mean we throw rigor out with everything else and just think, well, my method's valid because I say it is. No, the traditional rules of validity still apply. So here's a visual abstract of different methods and how they map onto specific phases, let's say, in your design. And I love this image. So looking at the items on the left here and then trying to map them across, right? Well, when we start a design project, we start down here at the bottom where we're doing user needs and site objectives or application objectives or whatever. And we're in an abstract space. We're not talking about system at this point or any of those things. And what's useful at that phase are things like contextual inquiry, interviews, focus groups, different things like that. As you step up, okay, now we've captured some of those needs. We need to get into functional specifications and content requirements. So this is where you will look at contextual design, affinity diagrams. This is where you'll start to map out your functional requirements analysis or function allocation if you're using those. Stepping up next to the actual design of interactions and information architecture. This is where you tend to use storyboards or cognitive walkthroughs. This is also where you'll use information architecture specific methods like card sorts and those kind of things. And as we move up, next we've got the actual interface components, both info design and visual design. And this is where we're looking at wireframes, prototyping, heuristics evaluations. This is where you get other people who know kind of the rules of HCI or UX, and they can look at it and give you their expert feedback. Think alouds. So think alouds are far and away, in my opinion, one of the best methods for anything. I would even put them above contextual inquiry. This is relatively simple. You put somebody in front of an interface and tell them to think aloud, and you don't respond. You don't say a word for 10-15 minutes. Let them poke around and just record what they say. And if they get stuck, tell them ahead of time, hey, I'm not going to help you if you get stuck. You got to just, again, narrate your experience. Super helpful. First, like, minute to 30 seconds maybe is a little awkward, but then they get into the flow. So super helpful. And obviously, when we get to visual design, we have typography concerns, color theory, all that stuff, which is still critically important to look at. But as you can see, when we get up there, we're also up in a more complete and a more concrete phase. We now have something we're looking at. So again, it's useful to look at this. Keep in mind, though, these phases are not necessarily exclusive. You can wireframe all the way back in your user needs. You can also do storyboarding back there. So this is typically where they'll live, but they don't have to. So you need to be more kind of focused on those things. So guerrilla user research. This is also a great way to cheaply and quickly get some feedback on a prototype. So you go to where people are and you start doing spot recruiting. So pros, it's cheaper, there's less planning, and it's less data intensive. Cons, you kind of need the right person to be able to do this. You can't be meek. Typically you need some kind of like what this gal has with these signs, where you have to be very explicit. You're not trying to sell people something, but it still takes a certain type of person to be able to walk up to strangers and say, hey, will you come poke at my phone, this phone I have, for 5 minutes and tell me what you think? It's just a weird thing, but can be super effective because you can collect a lot of data in a short period of time. It's usually too quick for demographic questions. You're not going to get people's age, race, job, all those things in this format. So your data collection will also have to be qualitative and fast. So there's lots of different ways to do this. I encourage, looking up some different videos or articles on it, because you can do it a lot of different ways. It's great for getting a lot of responses quickly, good for medium fidelity prototypes, but you can also use it for standard wireframes or those things. And then there's this, I always love this, where this is how you don't do guerrilla research, right? You don't attach your cameras and your eye trackers and everything and then go meet somebody at the coffee shop. That's not how this is used. So that speaks to kind of that data validity and data strength. But it's also important to use as an adaptive tool, because a lot of times, especially if you're in a course, you don't have a user research budget. So you have to just go find your friends and family and say, hey, do this thing real quick. And that's what we have to do a lot of times in user experiences. Especially, you might be halfway through a project and you iterate on a new feature. Now you've got to do all this with that new feature. So you have to make sure you can be adaptable. So contextual inquiry is kind of one of the bread and butter methods of HCI, I'd say. So this is a kind of like a think aloud, in the sense of you're asking your user to narrate some kind of experience, but in this, you essentially sit with them and allow them to teach you how to use a thing. You don't use it, you're not at the keyboard, they are. Can be 2 to 3 hours long, it doesn't have to be, but it can be. the goal of this is to capture these four principles here. We want to know the context of the system and how it's used in that context. Partnerships, so are we, what connections do you need in this system out in the wild to make it work? You need to capture the interpretations. So this is observations that the user has and the developer. And then you want a focus. So you'll also capture pain points as a part of this. So that's another thing I'd want to say is contextual inquiry can be used as like a prototype evaluation tool, but more often we know there's something wrong with this system or process, but we're not totally sure where to focus our efforts. So you go and you sit with them and you watch them do things. And this isn't like Think Aloud where you just sit back and be quiet. You can interact. So if somebody does something that looks kind of weird, like it's a strange interaction, you can stop them and say, hey, what was that? And why'd you do that? And they might say, oh, we have to do that because if you click this button that maybe is the expected interaction, it breaks because of X, Y, and Z. And it can be very useful. It's also a great way to build user rapport. Most users are glad to serve as the expert and to help educate you about what they do. So it's a way we can leverage kind of that psychological want to help in a good way. And can be done in a lot of different ways. It can be done super formally, super informally. Again, if you're looking for examples, I'd say, Google around just contextual inquiry. I know usually the Nielsen Norman group always has kind of great 101 articles or case studies that can be used for it. But this is just generally the framework and the kind of structure of that process. Task analysis. So this is a big one, and we probably won't get into this a lot in this course just because task analysis of interfaces, like computer interfaces, is less common. Usually you're trying to do a task analysis about the task, and the interface is the tool you use to achieve the task. But it's still a valid approach, obviously, in all human factors and user experience work. There's a lot of different approaches to task analysis, all of them with different, I'd say different ancestries or different validity that's been backed up over the years. But the big ones are cognitive task analysis, or CTA, tabular task analysis, hierarchical is a very common one you'll see, and then cognitive work analysis, which is kind of a cognitive task analysis but with a slightly different goal. So all of these are valid. They're typically very rigorous, and they take a lot of work to really kind of get through. Like I said, we typically use them to research a specific scenario or situation, and you try not to get caught up in the basic tasks of, okay, we need to capture which keys they hit or anything. We're at a higher level, think of it like a goal-based approach almost. And as we're going through task analysis, and these kind of apply also to all the methods. We talked a little bit about this with the principles of contextual inquiry, but I'd say a lot of these are going to transcend any singular method. So, as a part of all of this, we're trying to capture the user information. Who are they? What do they know? What motivates them? What are their issues? Are there specific accommodations, of the situation? Tasks, what are the tasks that the new design is supposed to accomplish, and how are they doing it now? That second part is absolutely critical. A lot of times people jump in and just start redesigning a thing. Stop it. Don't do that. You need to understand why something is the way it is before you can at all understand how to fix it. So you need to really dig in on that side of things. So be aware of that. Most of the worst interfaces we've gotten in our daily lives, whether at work or just in life, are because some developer or or designer or whoever, project manager maybe, parachuted in with all the answers to all the problems, but didn't take the time to understand why those maybe aren't problems. Maybe they're things that are required. So, and then the environment. So, you need to understand the physical environment that these folks are occupying, what's the social environment, organizational culture, all those things. So there are important aspects to any of these methods to have success. Personas. So we'll get into some examples here, but personas, they get a lot of flack. A lot of times people think they're too squishy, too, touchy-feely or whatever for something like this. They're wrong, but it's because of what they're applying it to. They're thinking that we're creating a persona so that we can, create these archetypes or specific, goal users or things like that. And some people might disagree with me here, but to me, a persona is less about your users and more about you. We have some pretty intense problems as humans with accurately perceiving and understanding what other people think. And not in the sense of we sit there and we're so confused, but in the sense of we think everybody's like us. We think we have things in common with everybody. And we do, but not in the way that we typically think. And so personas really help the designer to force us to consider other perspectives so that you actually build something that is useful for people that aren't you. But fundamentally, they're abstracted instances of a person. They are likely to be prospective users, but you also, sometimes folks will use personas to capture stakeholders as well. They're completely fictional. They should not, and on that point, truly completely fictional. Don't model personas off of people you know. That totally negates the point. You know those people. You know their differences with you. That's not who we're designing for. So make sure they are truly, totally fictional. They should represent your population of users. Some people might say, well, aren't we stereotyping? Yeah. Stereotyping is a very critical feature of human psychology. When applied badly in a biased way, we get to some really negative consequences. But stereotyping can be valuable when we're doing something at scale. We can't design for every Bill, Linda, Karen, whoever. We have to design for a lot of different groups to make any successful product or something that's useful. So we do have to do a little bit of stereotyping, and that's can be a bummer, but it's also important to be aware of that so that you don't use it for evil. Here's some examples of personas. They don't all have to look like this. So I tried to pick some different examples to show how fancy you can make them and how practical you can. So here's an example of what I would call a very fancy. And there are tons and tons and tons of templates out there if you need. But this is a very fancy persona example. Here's a more simple one, but still completely digital. And here's a template. I like this template because of mainly these headings. I don't really care about the rest of this, but I like that it makes you separate these things and fill them in so that you capture enough stuff. Also, you'll notice all of these have a picture. That is important. Humans are visual creatures. We use pictures, and pictures carry a lot of our own assumptions with them, so you still need to do that. And going back there real quick, just to note, these also can be scribbled on a whiteboard with like terrible art. They don't all have to be designed in such a nice way. These are examples out there, probably, I'm guessing, because the broader user experience community might be a little bit nervous to show what happens behind conference room doors on those whiteboards, but you shouldn't be. Then why do we use them? I talked about this a little bit. It forces our recognition of others. User-centered design is not fundamentally natural to us. Self-centered design is. So this is another distinction to make, though. Personas are different from users. Users are an abstract concept. They're not tangible. Personas also are completely fictionalized and abstract, but they're more tangible and concrete. Then they're memorable, relatable, predictable, and it's easy to talk about. It's hard to talk about users. It's easy to talk about our potential persona, Glenda, who uses this application for hiking and walking her dog twice a month. Like, it brings it more, it aligns more with our mental model of how we talk about people, and it reinforces that human-centered approach. It also helps us make our assumptions explicit, and they should be based on knowledge, facts, research. You also can use personas then as an evaluative tool where you kind of step back with a persona. And they focus on a small set of users that are supposed to represent kind of a good cross-section of your entire population. So I won't spend a lot of time on this because this is also an extremely rigorous approach that most people not in safety significant spaces or industrial spaces will ever use, but they are valuable. So functional requirements analysis and function allocation. You'll typically see them grouped together because they're kind of two sides of the same coin. They're both basically big lists. Your FRA, your functional requirements analysis, is what does each function of this system require? So for this pump or valve or interface, whatever, what is necessary for it to perform correctly? It doesn't just have to be strict engineering principles. This could be, okay, a functional requirements analysis of the Boeing 737 MAX MCAS system. For that system to work properly, probably needs to be maintained well, have multiple sensors, and a robust training platform. It didn't have any of those. Then function allocation is how we decide who's doing the function or what. Is this a function the person will be doing? Is this a function that some automated electronic system will do? Is there a computational thing? Is this an FPGA? Whatever. But I just wanted to note these because they're not used a lot in the broader HCI user experience space, and I think that that is a shame. I think we could come up with more useful and not cumbersome versions of these that would be super helpful in our space, but so far has not occurred. So as you're going through and you're using these methods, you're going to have to identify tasks and scenarios. So you want to make sure that as you're going through, they're realistic, they're applicable to your users, and they're valuable. You can typically get them from your users or from your initial research on the topic. You might have specific SMEs giving you feedback on, well, this is how this system has to work or whatnot there. But as you break them down, you have scenarios, which are typically an informal narrative story. This is kind of, you have a start point and an end point. You're going to track how well they progress through the scenario. They're typically very natural for users, but they're not very generalizable unless you are using a highly repetitive or procedural scenario. So if the user can just kind of navigate freely, each one of your users will have a completely different scenario experience, which is fine as long as you're not trying to generalize them. Then use cases. So this might be a specific we want you to approve an invoice in the system, or something like that. You assume this baseline interaction, you assume there's an understanding of the interaction, and then you ask them to undertake it. Critical tasks or use cases, this is kind of a separate assumption where you don't necessarily assume that there will be an interaction or a detailed understanding of the interaction. You might have that, but you really need to step away from the details of the user task and look at it from almost from a systems lens of, okay, what is the critical thing the user has to do? What's the thing they can't mess up if they're going to be successful? And that is a different approach. Again, very commonly taken in safety significant industries, less so if you're designing, what would we call them, consumer applications. But still, I would say on, maybe this will resonate with folks, but I would say that not accidentally, or I guess interacting with an ex's Instagram account might have some critical tasks, some things that you maybe want to do to be successful or don't want to do to be successful in whatever your motive is there. So that's still something to consider. And also at every point consider, what if they just didn't? So scenarios, we've already talked about this a little bit, but they're concrete examples of an activity within the scope. They can be rough and kind of underspecified, or you can be hyper specific. They provide an orientation for the user, and they evoke questions that are easy to relate to. Now, potential problems with scenarios, by relating it to a real situation, we have a tendency as designers to get tunnel vision around that scenario. And that is something that will happen. So that's why it's valuable to have a diverse team that isn't all involved in those things, so that people can help bring you back from the trees to look at the forest. And the persona or stereotype that you're dealing with might drive specific expectations that are kind of limiting. But the final point is the most important, which is they should not be used in isolation. A scenario on its own, not valuable. A scenario used to validate assumptions or to iterate, super valuable. But they're not just useful as they stand. Storyboards and journeys. So this is also one of those squishy, touchy-feely things that some people don't like, because storyboard sounds, I'm going to guess, artsy, and people flip out. And when we say user journey, I think that it brings to mind images of hippies or yoga teachers or something. But it's critical, they are critical methods for user experience and HCI. So what are they? They capture your user's progress through an interaction with your system. This is an example of one that's totally digital and nice looking there, and kind of how it breaks down from IDF. But I also wanted to give you some examples of how it actually happens. So here's an example of one. Typically, these are the common things that you'll have, but these headings or core focus points might shift, depending on what you're chasing after. But you typically have phases of actions. You have specific touch points, so that touch points are interactions with your system. Emotions, this captures when your user is in this phase, how generally do they feel? If you're trying to design a system that has some kind of hard parts, like maybe they're doing like think of it like let's say we had a health questionnaire, there might be questions that are going to elicit kind of a negative mood, and that's okay, but you need to capture that. Here's another one. This is a good one that shows kind of a purchase flow. This is also something that is used a lot. You'll notice sticky notes are very common, as well as, kind of this flowcharty method. Keep in mind with the sticky notes, there does seem to be a pattern here. And that's usually what it is. Usually the color of sticky notes denotes something about what it is. Maybe it might be all these pink things are critical tasks or something. Whatever you do, select it as a team at the beginning, don't deviate. Also note, you should never show up to one of these whiteboarding sessions without a full stack of sticky notes and probably an unopened pack of markers. It's just a good recommendation. And then just leave the markers behind. You know, your budget could probably swallow the cost of some expo markers. Here's another one that shows this again. It's got a timeline. We have some different phases here, and it's going down. Notice that the depth of some of these, you know, if we go over here to where this gal is here, okay, this one might be bigger. This part might have more stuff in it, and that's good, but this visual representation is super helpful. Here's a great example of a drawn persona. So not digital like our previous examples. Still far too fancy and nice for me. I couldn't ever do this. My handwriting's terrible, but still, you can do it that way, and it's okay. So I wanted to come back to here again. Just, we've covered some of these now, so I want you to pause it and just kind of reflect for a second on, okay, is this starting to make sense? How we build these experiences for folks and how it's going to be valuable for them. And next we'll jump into prototyping. So thanks for watching. Hope it was valuable.